All right, so today we're taking a deep dive into a pretty intense period of history. You sent us a Wikipedia article, and it's, get this, in Chinese.
Yeah.
It's about the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. Have you heard of this?
Oh, absolutely. It's a fascinating rebellion against the Qing dynasty back in the mid-19th century. Really a pivotal moment in Chinese history.
It sounds like it. So this Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, it was more than just a military thing, right? I mean, there's like religious aspects to it too.
Right. It wasn't just about grabbing power. It was really driven by this incredibly potent mix of like religious fervor, this yearning for social change, and this almost utopian vision of how society could be. And that really gripped a huge part of China. It wasn't a small fringe movement.
Wow. So to understand this, we kind of need to go back, right? Like, what was going on in China during the 1800s?
Okay, so imagine China in the 1800s. The Qing dynasty is in power, but already facing a bunch of internal problems. You've got economic issues, social unrest, people are frustrated.
And then on top of all that, they get hit with the Opium Wars, right?
Exactly. It's like adding fuel to the fire. These wars were forced on them by Western powers, mostly Britain, who were, they were determined to control the opium trade. And it really exposed how weak the Qing military was.
Like the perfect setup for a rebellion.
Oh, absolutely. So into this whole mess walks a guy named Hong Xiuquan. He fails his civil service exams, so, not off to a great start.
Yeah, not exactly the typical path to revolutionary leader.
But then he starts having these really intense visions, and he blends these visions. He blends ideas from Christianity, which were starting to trickle into China, with his own beliefs, and he forms what he calls the God-worshipping society.
Okay, the God-worshipping society, what were they all about? What was their deal?
They were pretty radical. Even for today, they'd be considered pretty radical. I mean, he basically called for the complete overthrow of the Qing dynasty. He didn't just want to reform it, he wanted it gone.
Yeah, he wanted to hit the reset button.
He called them demons, the Qing rulers, his goal, a heavenly kingdom right here on Earth. He envisioned this utopia, this perfect society based on his own interpretation of Christianity, but also with this strong emphasis on social justice. It was a really revolutionary concept for the time.
So in all this chaos and turmoil, how did his message resonate with people? I mean, why did anyone listen to him?
Well, you have to remember, there were a lot of people who were really struggling. His message really hit home with those who felt marginalized, especially the Hakka people. They were a Han Chinese subgroup, but they faced a lot of discrimination.
So they felt like outsiders.
Exactly. And they became the core of Hong's early followers. They were drawn to this promise of a fairer, more just society. It was a powerful message.
So was that sense of injustice, was that really the spark that ignited the whole rebellion?
I'd say it was a huge factor. In 1851, the God-worshipping society, driven by, this burning desire for change for a better life, but also this really intense religious zeal, they launched what's called the Jintian Uprising in Guangxi province. This wasn't just a protest, it was a full-blown war against the Qing dynasty.
And it took off pretty quickly, right? I mean, they had that distinct look, the long hair.
Oh yeah, they stood out. The long hair, it was a direct challenge to the Qing dynasties, their mandatory Q hairstyle. Like men had to shave the front of their heads and wear a braid. So it was this really visible symbol of rebellion.
A real in-your-face kind of statement.
Exactly, and they weren't just about looks, they were also incredibly effective militarily. I mean, they marched north, they picked up more and more followers as they went, winning victories against Qing forces, taking over towns. People saw them as liberators.
Like they were actually delivering on those promises.
And it all culminated in this major victory in 1853.
Yeah.
They captured Nanjing, one of the most important cities in China.
They didn't just capture it, they renamed it, right?
Right. They renamed it Tianjin, meaning heavenly capital. And that's where they set up their own government, their own laws. They were really trying to build a new world.
So they were putting those radical ideas, the land redistribution, communal living, they were actually putting that stuff into practice.
They really were. They took land from the wealthy and divided it among the people. Communal living was the norm.
Yeah.
And it was all based on their unique blend of like Christianity and Hong Xiuquan's pronouncements. It was a total overhaul of how Chinese society worked.
Wow, so they're winning battles, setting the new government, reshaping society. It sounds like they were on a roll. But land redistribution, I mean, that's a huge change. How do people react to that?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting, right? Because while those reforms attracted a lot of people, they also created some friction. You see, the Taiping leadership, they weren't all on the same page. They had different ideas about what this heavenly kingdom should look like.
So even with all those victories, there were cracks starting to show.
Oh, yeah. Those cracks were definitely there. It wasn't just philosophical debates, it was more than that. These disagreements, they actually led to some pretty serious consequences, like the what's called the Tianjin incident in 1856.
The Tianjin incident, that sounds pretty bad. What happened?
It all centered around Yang Shiqing. He was the East King, a really key figure in the movement. Very powerful. But some people, they started seeing him as a threat to Hong Xiuquan, like maybe he wanted to take over.
So was this like a personality clash, or was it more about how they wanted to run the Heavenly Kingdom?
It was probably a bit of both, honestly. Yang was definitely ambitious, and it's likely he had his own ideas about how things should be done. But anyway, it all culminated in this really bloody purge. Yang and his supporters, they were massacred.
Wow. So they basically turned on each other.
They did, and it really weakened the movement. Some key figures, even Shi Kai, he was one of their best military commanders, he left after that. He just couldn't stay.
So after all that success, these internal conflicts, they really set them back.
Oh, for sure. The Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, they never really fully recovered from that. And it wasn't just the infighting, it was also that the Qing dynasty, they started to get their act together. They started figuring out how to fight back.
So the Qing dynasty was making a comeback.
Yeah, they were. They were able to build up their forces, especially with these regional armies. Like the Qing army, they were brutal but effective. But there's another piece to this puzzle. You got to remember the Western powers.
Right, because at first, weren't some of them kind of sympathetic to the Taipings?
At the very beginning, yeah. Some Western powers, they thought maybe the Taiping rebellion could weaken the Qing dynasty, which could open up more trade for them.
So it was all about opportunity.
Pretty much. But the Taipings, they were really strongly opposed to the opium trade.
Which was like the main thing the West wanted from China.
Exactly. So the Taiping's anti-opium stance, it kind of backfired. It alienated those potential allies.
Wow, that's ironic. They were trying to do what they thought was right for China, and it ended up hurting them.
It happened. So anyway, the West, they ended up siding with the Qing dynasty. They gave them weapons, training, even direct military support. And that really tipped the scales.
So the Taipings were kind of caught in the middle, fighting their own internal battles and then facing this external pressure from the West.
They were, and it took a toll. They kept fighting, but they were losing ground. Key leaders died in battle, and even the people who had supported them, a lot of them, they started losing hope as the war dragged on. It was just so much hardship.
It must have been really disheartening for those who truly believed in that vision of a heavenly kingdom.
I'm sure it was. And then, in 1864, after a really brutal siege, Nanjing, their heavenly capital, it fell to the Qing forces. It was a devastating loss. It basically marked the end of the rebellion.
And what about the leaders? What happened to Hong and the others?
Well, Hong Xiuquan, he actually died a month before Nanjing fell. But his son, his heir, he was captured and executed. And a lot of the other leaders, they met the same fate. It was over.
Such a tragic end to a movement that had so much potential. But even though it failed, it must have had some lasting impact, right?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, the human cost was immense. We're talking about millions of people who died. It's one of the deadliest conflicts in human history.
It's almost impossible to wrap your head around that kind of loss.
It really is. And beyond the immediate casualties, the rebellion, it really weakened the Qing dynasty. Even though they won, it took a toll. It exposed their weaknesses and kind of sped up their decline.
So even in defeat, the Taipings helped to bring about the end of the dynasty.
In a way, yeah. And they also left this legacy of social and economic change. Even though those radical reforms were eventually reversed, they got people thinking about things like land ownership and equality and justice. They planted a seed.
So their ideas, even though they weren't fully realized, they still had an influence.
Definitely. Those ideas, the equality, the social reform, the resistance, those themes resonated with people, and they inspired later revolutionaries who, they were still trying to figure out how to build a better China.
This whole deep dive, it's been really eye-opening.
Yeah.
We started with the opium wars and ended up talking about this vision of a heavenly kingdom and, millions of people dying. It's a lot to process.
It really is. And I think what makes the Taiping Rebellion so interesting is that it wasn't just one thing that caused it to succeed or fail. It was this mix of things. Their own internal problems, the Qing dynasty adapting, the West getting involved. It was complicated.
So what does it all mean? Why should we care about this rebellion that happened so long ago?
Well, I think it teaches us some things that are still relevant today. It reminds us how powerful ideas can be, especially when people are unhappy and looking for something better.
It's like Hong Yu-kwan. He tapped into this desire for change. He mixed religion and social reform and created this movement that, even though it failed, it really shook things up.
Exactly. And it shows how those internal divisions, but also the pressure from outside, it can make or break even the most powerful movements.
It seems like understanding history isn't just about memorizing dates. It's about understanding these bigger forces, how they shape things. What else can we learn from all this? It's like the Taiping Rebellion. It gives us this glimpse into these really fundamental struggles, right? Like the fight for equality, that tension between like the old ways and trying to change things, and how these global forces can impact what seems like a local event.
Yeah, it definitely highlights those themes that, they keep popping up throughout history. And it also reminds us that history isn't just about, like, the big names and the battles. It's about, real people living their lives and making choices in these, like, crazy circumstances.
That makes me think about something you said earlier about the casualties, like millions of people dying. That's hard to even imagine.
It's mind-boggling. Imagine entire communities uprooted, families torn apart, countless people facing just unimaginable hardship. The Taiping Rebellion wasn't just some abstract political thing, It was real people trying to survive, trying to make a better life for themselves and their families.
Yeah, it really puts things into perspective. I mean, revolutions, even if they have good intentions, they come at a cost. It makes you think, like, if I were living back then, if I were a peasant in China in the 1850s, and I heard about this heavenly kingdom, would I risk everything to join?
It's a tough question. On the one hand, you have this promise of a world without poverty, without oppression, a world where everyone shares the land and has a chance to prosper. That must have been so tempting, especially if you had nothing to lose. But the risks, they were huge. Violence, hardship, death.
I don't know what I would do. It's easy to judge from where we are now, but it reminds you that history is made by real people facing incredibly difficult decisions.
Absolutely. And their stories, the triumphs, the tragedies, they deserve to be remembered.
They do. So wrapping up this deep dive into the Taiping Rebellion, I mean, we've learned so much. The scale of the events, the complexity of it all, it really makes you think about what it means to be human.
It does. And the rebellion, even though it failed, it's still relevant today. It's like this lens through which we can look at these ongoing tensions between tradition and progress, the role of religion in politics, and that complex relationship between China and the West.
Those are issues we're still dealing with today in different forms.
Exactly. So to wrap things up, the Taiping Rebellion, it didn't achieve its goals, but it left a mark on the world. It sparked change, raised questions, and, it continues to inspire people.
It's a story that stays with you. So, a final thought for our listeners. What other events in history might offer similar lessons about the power of ideas, the challenges of social change, and the human cost of revolution? Keep exploring these questions. See how the past can shed light on the present and help us understand the future. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.